The world into which Tomoe Gozen emerged was not one that celebrated individuality or exceptionalism for its own sake. It was a rigid, hierarchical society shaped by centuries of courtly tradition, ritual authority, and inherited status. It stood on the brink of a profound transformation. The late Heian period was an age of quiet tension, where the refined elegance of Kyoto's aristocratic elite masked a growing erosion of their political power. For generations, emperors and court nobles had governed Japan through ceremony, poetry, and precedent, but real authority was increasingly slipping away from lacquered halls and into the hands of armed families in the provinces. Understanding Tomoe Gozen begins not with her actions, but with this unstable world that made her presence possible. By the 12th century, the imperial court still projected cultural dominance, but it no longer controlled the mechanisms of force. Provincial estates, often distant from Kyoto, were overseen by warrior families tasked with maintaining order, collecting taxes, and defending land. These families, ancestors of what would later be called the samurai class, lived in a harsher reality than their courtly counterparts. Their lives were shaped by riding, archery, and combat readiness, not court intrigue or aesthetic refinement. Over time, these warriors developed their own codes of loyalty and honor, grounded in service to clan leaders rather than devotion to the emperor himself. Power, once symbolic, became increasingly militarized. This shift created a fracture at the heart of Japanese society. The court still claimed legitimacy, but it relied on warriors to enforce its will. Meanwhile, those warriors grew aware of their own strength and necessity. The balance could not hold indefinitely. As estates expanded and rival clans competed for influence, violence became not an aberration, but an expected tool of political negotiation. It was within this climate that the Minamoto and Terra clans rose to prominence, not as rebels against the system, but as products of its decay. Their rivalry was the inevitable outcome of a state that had outsourced force without retaining control over it. Within warrior households, life followed a different rhythm from that of the capital. Survival depended on readiness, discipline, and loyalty. Children grew up surrounded by weapons, horses, and stories of battle. While men were expected to fight, women were not excluded from martial culture in the way later centuries would assume. They were trained to defend homes, manage estates, and, when necessary, take up arms. This was not a society that promoted equality, but neither was it one that entirely barred women from violence. The demands of frontier life often overrode rigid ideals, allowing practicality to shape custom. The late Heian period was also marked by a sense of inevitability, a widespread belief that the world had entered an age of decline known as Mappo, the final era of Buddhist law. This belief fostered both resignation and urgency. For some, it encouraged retreat into religious devotion. For others, it justified ambition and force, since the old moral order was thought to be collapsing anyway. Warfare, once episodic, became prolonged and consuming. Campaigns stretched across seasons, and victory no longer guaranteed stability. Every success bred new rivals. Every defeat sowed resentment. In such a world, individual lives were often swallowed by larger forces. Warriors served causes greater than themselves, bound by obligations they did not choose. Loyalty to a lord was not merely a contract, but a moral absolute, reinforced by kinship and reputation. Honor was collective, not personal. A warrior's worth was measured by service rendered and obedience maintained, not by self-expression. For someone like Tomoe Gozen to later stand out within historical memory, the conditions had to be extraordinary because the culture itself discouraged singular recognition. Geography also played its part. Japan's mountainous terrain and scattered estates meant that authority was fragmented. Local leaders wielded immense autonomy, and communication with the capital was slow. This allowed regional figures to rise rapidly when opportunity emerged. It also meant that warfare was intimate and brutal, fought face-to-face rather than at a distance. Personal valor mattered because battles were decided not by vast formations, but by the cohesion and morale of relatively small forces. Reputation traveled through stories carried by survivors, not through official proclamations. By the time the Genpei War loomed on the horizon, Japan was already primed for conflict. Decades of localized violence had normalized the presence of armed struggle in daily life. The court's inability to restrain the great clans made large-scale war not only possible, but likely. When it came, it would not simply decide who ruled Japan. It would determine what kind of society Japan would become. The old aristocratic order would not survive intact, and a new warrior-led government would rise in its place. Tomoe Gozen did not emerge in defiance of her age, but within it. The structures that allowed her to be trained, armed, and present on the battlefield were already in place long before her name appeared in chronicles. Her story begins in a world where power was shifting, norms were bending under pressure, and survival demanded adaptability. To understand her later actions, one must first recognize that she was shaped by an era in motion, where tradition and necessity collided, and where the boundaries of role and identity, though firm, were not yet sealed shut. In the warrior society of late Heian Japan, expectations for women were shaped less by ideology than by necessity, lineage, and circumstance. While court literature often portrayed women as refined figures removed from violence, the realities of provincial life told a more complex story. Samurai households were not merely families, but operational units responsible for land, retainers, and defense. In such environments, rigid separation between male and female roles was impractical. Women were expected to uphold household stability, protect honor, and ensure continuity, responsibilities that sometimes required familiarity with weapons and combat readiness rather than passive withdrawal from danger. Training for women in warrior families was not universal, nor was it identical to that of men, but it was far from exceptional. Many women learned to wield the naginata, a polearm well-suited for defense against mounted attackers, as well as the short sword kept within the home. This training was not framed as preparation for glory on the battlefield, but as an extension of domestic duty. If a household came under attack while its men were away, it was the women who were expected to resist, delay, or die with honor rather than submit. Courage, therefore, was not gendered. It was familial. Social expectations reinforced this dual role. A samurai woman was judged not only by obedience or modesty, but by composure under threat. Stories circulated of women who defended gates, rallied servants, or took their own lives to avoid capture, acts praised as evidence of loyalty and moral strength. These narratives reveal a cultural framework in which women were not excluded from the ethical demands of the warrior class. They were bound by them, even if their opportunities to act publicly were constrained. At the same time, clear limitations existed. Women were rarely recognized as independent military actors. Their participation was justified only when it served male authority or family survival. Leadership, command, and political ambition remained overwhelmingly male domains. When women crossed into spaces associated with open warfare, chroniclers often framed their actions as remarkable precisely because they disrupted expectations. This tension between capability and recognition is central to understanding how figures like Tomoe Gozen would later be remembered. The warrior ethic of the period emphasized loyalty over individuality. For women, this meant their actions were interpreted through relationships rather than personal identity. A woman fought as a daughter, wife, or retainer, not as a self-directed agent. Her bravery enhanced the reputation of her lord or family, not her own standing. As a result, even when women took part in violent conflict, their stories were often absorbed into the legacy of the men they served. Historical silence, therefore, does not imply absence, but rather a hierarchy of remembrance. Religion and philosophy also shaped expectations. Buddhist ideas about impermanence and suffering coexisted with Confucian-inspired hierarchies that emphasized obedience and order. Women were often associated with emotional instability or spiritual impurity in religious discourse, Yet these beliefs did not prevent their practical involvement in defense. Instead, they created a contradiction where women were simultaneously deemed unsuited for violence and expected to confront it when circumstances demanded. This contradiction did not resolve itself. It was simply lived with. Marriage further complicated the picture. Samurai marriages were strategic, binding families and consolidating power. A woman entering a warrior household was expected to adapt fully to its obligations, including its dangers. Loyalty transferred from her birth family to her husband's line, reinforcing the idea that her body and skills were assets of the household rather than her own. This framework could enable training and responsibility, but it denied autonomy. A woman could be trusted with a weapon, yet never with authority independent of male oversight. It is important to note that these expectations vary by region and circumstance. Frontier areas facing frequent unrest demanded more from everyone, regardless of gender. In such places, skill mattered more than convention. A capable woman was valued not because she defied norms, but because she met needs. This pragmatic flexibility explains how women could be present in military contexts without those contexts being redefined around them. Exception did not require revolution. It required usefulness. The historical record preserves only fragments of these realities, filtered through male-authored chronicles that prioritized lineage and command. When women appear, it is often briefly, their actions noted but not explored. This scarcity has encouraged later generations to either romanticize or dismiss their roles. Both responses miss the point. The truth lies in recognizing that women's participation in warrior culture was neither symbolic nor equal, but functional and conditional. Understanding these expectations is essential before considering any individual story. Without this foundation, later actions risk being misinterpreted as anachronistic rebellion rather than contextual response. Women like Tomoe did not step outside their world. They operated within its pressures, obligations, and contradictions. The society of late Heian Japan did not imagine female warriors as ideals, but made space for them when survival required it. That space was narrow, fragile, and rarely acknowledged, yet it existed, and within it, extraordinary figures could act without needing to announce themselves as extraordinary at all. The outbreak of the Genpei War did not arrive as a sudden rupture, but as the release of pressures that had been building for decades. By the late 12th century, Japan's political system was already strained by competing sources of authority. The imperial court remained the symbolic center of legitimacy, yet real power increasingly rested with military families who controlled land, troops, and regional loyalty. Among these families, rivalry had become normalized, and disputes that once might have been settled through court mediation were now resolved through force. The Genpei War emerged from this environment as an inevitable confrontation rather than an unexpected catastrophe. At the heart of the conflict stood two great warrior houses, the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan. Both traced their lineage to imperial ancestry, a fact that granted them prestige but also intensified their competition. For generations, these clans had served the court as enforcers, suppressing rebellions and maintaining order in distant provinces. Over time, their military success translated into political influence, allowing them to place allies in court positions and shape imperial decisions. What began as service gradually transformed into dominance. The Taira clan, under the leadership of Taira no Kayamori, achieved a level of power unprecedented for a warrior family. Kayamori's influence at court, his marriage alliances, and his placement of relatives in key positions created resentment among both aristocrats and rival warriors. His success exposed a fundamental contradiction within the system. A warrior could uphold imperial authority while simultaneously overshadowing it. This imbalance bred hostility, particularly among the Minamoto, who had suffered exile and execution in earlier power struggles. The memory of these losses did not fade. It hardened into a sense of unresolved injustice. The spark that ignited open war came in 1180, when Prince Machihito issued a call to arms against the Terra, appealing directly to the Minamoto for support. This appeal was more than a political maneuver. It was an invitation to dismantle the existing order. Although the prince's rebellion was quickly crushed, the call resonated across the provinces. Warrior families who had long chafed under Terra dominance now had a cause that legitimized rebellion. What followed was not a single uprising, but a chain reaction as regional leaders mobilized forces in the name of restoring balance and honor. Once violence escalated, it spread rapidly. The geography of Japan worked against containment. Mountain passes, river crossings, and coastal routes became strategic choke points, and control shifted repeatedly as armies advanced and retreated. Unlike later periods of centralized warfare, the Genpei War was fragmented, fought through a series of regional campaigns rather than a single decisive front. This fragmentation drew in local actors whose loyalties were shaped by personal ties and immediate survival rather than abstract ideology. War became personal, intimate, and relentless. For those living through it, the Genpei War blurred the boundary between military and civilian life. Estates were burned, supply lines disrupted, and populations displaced. Warriors were not isolated professionals, but members of households whose families bore the consequences of defeat. This reality intensified loyalty while also raising the stakes of every engagement. To lose a battle was not merely to retreat. It was to risk annihilation, dishonor, and the erasure of one's lineage. Such conditions demanded unwavering commitment from everyone connected to the war effort. The war also transformed the nature of leadership. Commanders were judged not only by pedigree, but by their ability to inspire and sustain loyalty under prolonged strain. Reputation became a weapon in itself. Tales of bravery and cruelty traveled faster than armies, shaping decisions before battles were ever joined. In this environment, individual acts could carry disproportionate weight, influencing morale and allegiance. Yet these acts were never detached from the larger conflict. They mattered because the war had created a space where personal valor and collective fate were inseparable. Importantly, the Genpei War did not initially present itself as a struggle to overthrow the imperial system. Both sides claimed to act in its defense, accusing the other of corruption and overreach. This rhetorical symmetry masked the deeper reality that the war would permanently alter Japan's political structure. As fighting continued, the authority of the court weakened further, unable to restrain or resolve the conflict it had indirectly enabled. Military necessity, not ceremonial legitimacy, began to dictate outcomes. For individuals who would later enter the historical record, this phase of the war established the conditions of possibility. The chaos and scale of the conflict expanded roles and blurred conventions. Service was demanded wherever loyalty lay, and effectiveness often outweighed custom. The Genpei War created a world where extraordinary participation did not require ideological justification, only demonstrated value. Before names like Tomoe Gozen could be remembered, the war itself had to open the space in which memory could be earned. Thus, the beginning of the Genpei War marks more than the start of a military struggle. It marks the moment when Japan crossed from aristocratic governance into warrior rule. The conflict was the crucible in which a new order would be forged, one defined by force, loyalty, and consequence. Everything that followed, including the emergence of figures who defied later expectations, was shaped by this initial unraveling of the old world. Minamoto no Yoshinaka emerged from within the Minamoto clan not as its most powerful figure, but as one of its most precariously positioned. Raised far from the political center in the rugged provinces of eastern Japan, Yoshinaka's early life unfolded at the margins of elite power. This distance from Kyoto shaped both his outlook and his methods. He belonged fully to the warrior world rather than the courtly sphere, and his authority was built through local alliances, military competence, and personal loyalty rather than inherited prestige at court. When the Genpei War began, he was neither an obvious leader nor a symbolic figurehead, but a regional commander whose moment arrived through circumstance and action. Yoshinaka's relationship to the Minamoto cause was complicated by family history. The Minamoto clan had been fractured by earlier purges, exile, and internal rivalries, leaving its surviving branches geographically scattered and politically divided. Yoshinaka represented one such branch, distant cousins to the central Minamoto figures who would later dominate the war. This separation granted him autonomy, but denied him immediate legitimacy. He fought under the Minamoto name, yet his authority had to be earned on the battlefield rather than assumed through lineage recognition. When Yoshinaka raised forces in response to the call against the Terra, his campaign was marked by speed and decisiveness. Operating in mountainous terrain he knew intimately, he exploited local knowledge and regional support to achieve early victories. These successes elevated his status rapidly, transforming him from a peripheral actor into a central player in the conflict. For a time, he embodied the possibility that regional strength could overturn entrenched power. His victories were not merely tactical. They carried symbolic weight, signaling that the Terra were vulnerable beyond the court's reach. Yet Yoshinaka's rise also exposed the tensions inherent in the Minamoto coalition. Unlike his cousins Yoritomo and Yoshitsune, who cultivated legitimacy through careful coordination and political calculation, Yoshinaka relied on momentum and military success. His authority was personal and immediate, grounded in loyalty forged through shared hardship rather than bureaucratic control. This approach inspired fierce devotion among his followers, but it also made his position unstable. Loyalty secured through charisma could dissipate as quickly as it formed, especially when strategic conditions shifted. As Yoshinaka advanced toward Kyoto, his role grew increasingly ambiguous. He entered the capital as a liberator in name, yet his presence unsettled both the court and his own allies. The transition from regional warfare to national leadership demanded skills he had little reason to develop in the provinces. Court politics, ceremonial restraint, and symbolic legitimacy mattered in Kyoto in ways they had not on the frontier. Yoshinaka's blunt military authority clashed with expectations shaped by centuries of aristocratic governance, and his inability to navigate this environment eroded support among elites who feared disorder as much as terror dominance. Within the Minamoto clan, Yoshinaka's success became a liability. His rapid ascent threatened the carefully constructed authority of Yoritomo, who sought to position himself as the uncontested leader of the Minamoto cause. What had begun as a shared struggle against a common enemy gradually transformed into an internal contest over legitimacy, command, and the future shape of power. Yoshinaka found himself increasingly isolated, not because he had failed militarily, but because his victories disrupted the balance his cousins intended to control. It was within this context that Yoshinaka's leadership style became more rigid. Surrounded by enemies and rivals, he relied heavily on those whose loyalty was unquestioned. Personal retainers, trusted commanders, and devoted warriors formed the core of his remaining strength. Authority narrowed rather than expanded, concentrating around figures who had proven themselves in battle rather than through negotiation. This tightening of allegiance created a smaller but more intense circle of loyalty, one bound by shared risk and diminishing options. Yoshinaka's cause, once expansive, began to contract under pressure from multiple directions. Militarily, he faced superior numbers and coordination from rival Minamoto forces. Politically, he lacked the court's confidence. Strategically, his room to maneuver shrank as alliances dissolved. Yet despite these constraints, he did not retreat into passivity. His decisions during this period reflect a leader operating under siege, choosing action over compromise even as outcomes grew increasingly unfavorable. Understanding Yoshinaka is essential to understanding those who served him. His leadership did not offer security, long-term reward, or guaranteed survival. It offered immediacy, clarity of purpose, and absolute commitment. To follow him was to accept instability in exchange for honor and shared fate. This environment demanded exceptional resolve from those within his ranks, as loyalty to Yoshinaka became inseparable from acceptance of likely defeat. For figures like Tomoe Gozen, Yoshinaka's command created both opportunity and peril. His reliance on proven ability over formal status allowed capable individuals to assume visible roles. At the same time, his declining position magnified the risks borne by those closest to him. Yoshinaka's story is not simply one of failure or miscalculation. It is the story of a leader whose rise and fall exposed the limits of personal authority in a transforming political landscape. His cause mattered not because it succeeded, but because it shaped the conditions under which loyalty, bravery, and memory would later be tested to their limits. Tomoe Gozen enters the historical record not with a birth, a lineage, or a personal declaration, but through the language of war. She appears in medieval chronicles at the moment when events demanded notice, not when identity was being carefully preserved. This manner of introduction is significant. It reflects a world in which individuals were recorded only insofar as they intersected with power, conflict, and consequence. Tomoe is not presented as a curiosity or symbol. She is introduced as a functional presence within Minamoto no Yoshinaka's military forces, described in terms that emphasize ability rather than novelty. The primary source that preserves her name, the Heike Monogatari, does not pause to justify her existence. Instead, it situates her matter-of-factly among warriors, noting her strength, skill, and composure in battle. She is described as a woman of remarkable beauty, yet this detail does not overshadow the emphasis placed on her martial competence. She is said to be an exceptional horsewoman, a skilled archer, and a fighter capable of facing strong opponents without hesitation. The Chronicle's tone suggests that her presence required no explanation to contemporaries familiar with the demands of warfare, even if it would later astonish readers removed from that context. What is striking about Tomoe's appearance in the record is its restraint. She is not surrounded by mythic embellishment at this stage. Her actions are embedded within Yoshinaka's campaigns, presented as part of the operational reality of his army. This framing matters because it grounds her reputation in service rather than spectacle. She is not portrayed as fighting alone or outside command structures. Instead, she functions within them, acting on behalf of her lord and in alignment with his objectives. Her identity is inseparable from her role. This form of recognition reflects how medieval Japanese chroniclers understood significance. They did not record lives comprehensively. They recorded moments that illustrated virtue, loyalty, or failure. Tomoe appears because her conduct on the battlefield met these criteria. Her gender is acknowledged, but it is not treated as the central reason for her inclusion. Rather, it heightens the impression of her effectiveness, making her presence memorable without turning it into a narrative disruption. At the same time, the record is limited and selective. Tomoe's voice is absent. Her motivations, thoughts, and personal history are not explored. She exists through description, not testimony. This absence is not unique to her. It characterizes most figures of the period, especially those outside elite political circles. Yet for Tomoe, this silence has encouraged later generations to fill gaps with interpretation, often projecting modern assumptions backward. To understand her properly, one must resist that impulse and remain within the contours drawn by the sources themselves. The language used to describe Tomoe reveals how her contemporaries evaluated worth. Strength, courage, and loyalty were the defining measures, not conformity to social expectation. When chroniclers note her beauty, it does not function to soften her image or reframe her as an anomaly. Instead, it coexists with descriptions of violence and endurance, reflecting a worldview in which physical presence and martial ability were not mutually exclusive. Beauty does not negate danger. It intensifies the impression of mastery over circumstance. Tomoe's introduction also illuminates the nature of Yoshinaka's leadership. That a woman could be visibly present and later remembered within his forces suggests an environment that prioritized effectiveness under pressure. Yoshinaka's army, increasingly isolated and under threat, relied on those who could be trusted absolutely. In such conditions, conventional boundaries mattered less than demonstrated commitment. Tomoe's emergence in the record, therefore, tells us as much about the structure of Yoshinaka's command as it does about her individual capabilities. It is important to note that Tomoe is not introduced as unique in principle, but as exceptional in degree. The chronicles do not imply that she was the only woman capable of fighting, only that she stood out among those who did. This distinction matters. It anchors her story within a broader, if sparsely documented, reality of women's participation in warrior culture. Her remembrance does not invalidate the existence of others. It highlights how rarely the record preserves them. The moment Tomoe enters history is also a moment of contraction. Yoshinaka's position is becoming increasingly precarious, and the war is turning against him. As circumstances grow more desperate, the narrative tightens around those closest to him. Tomoe's visibility increases not because she has suddenly changed, but because the scale of the conflict around her is narrowing. In smaller, more embattled forces, individual actions carry greater narrative weight. The chronicle reflects this shift by focusing on figures who embody loyalty under strain. Crucially, Tomoe is not framed as a symbol of change or disruption. She is not presented as redefining women's roles or challenging societal norms. Those interpretations belong to later centuries. In her own time, she is presented as someone who fulfilled the demands placed upon her with exceptional competence. Her appearance in the historical record is therefore an unintended legacy of circumstance rather than a deliberate act of defiance. By the time her name is written, Tomoe Gozen is already shaped by the war that surrounds her. She is introduced not at the beginning of her life, but at the point where her actions intersect irrevocably with historical consequence. This is how many medieval figures enter memory, not through origin stories, but through moments of necessity. Tomoe's emergence follows this pattern precisely, anchoring her firmly within the world that produced her and setting the stage for how her actions would later be remembered, debated, and transformed by time. Service within Minamoto no Yoshinaka's forces was defined not by rank or ceremony, but by proximity to risk and reliability under pressure. As the war intensified and Yoshinaka's position grew more precarious, the structure of his command became increasingly personal. Authority flowed downward through trust rather than formal hierarchy, and those closest to him were expected to embody absolute loyalty. It was within this environment that Tomoe Gozen's role became more clearly defined, not as an ornament of legend, but as a functional and visible component of Yoshinaka's military household. To serve a war leader like Yoshinaka was to accept constant instability. Campaigns shifted rapidly, supplies were uncertain, and alliances dissolved without warning. In such conditions, warriors were valued not only for skill, but for dependability. Orders had to be carried out without hesitation, and retreat was rarely an option. Loyalty was tested daily, not through declarations, but through endurance. Tomoe's continued presence at Yoshinaka's side suggests that she had proven herself repeatedly in this demanding environment, earning a place among those he relied upon most. Service also implied visibility. Those entrusted with important tasks were placed where failure would be seen and remembered. Tomoe's association with Yoshinaka positioned her near the center of decision-making and danger alike. She was not confined to rear defense or symbolic duty. Instead, sources describe her riding into battle, engaging directly with enemy warriors, and maintaining composure amid chaos. This kind of service required not only physical capability, but psychological resilience, the ability to function clearly while surrounded by violence and uncertainty. Within samurai culture, loyalty to one's lord was the highest virtue, superseding personal survival or comfort. For retainers, identity was inseparable from service. A warrior's worth was measured by how fully they subordinated themselves to their lord's fate. In this framework, Tomoe's actions were not extraordinary expressions of individual ambition. They were manifestations of expected devotion carried to an exceptional degree. Her courage enhanced Yoshinaka's authority, reinforcing the image of a leader worthy of such fierce allegiance. Command within Yoshinaka's forces was fluid, shaped by circumstance rather than rigid rank. Those who demonstrated competence could find themselves entrusted with responsibility regardless of conventional status. This flexibility was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed capable individuals like Tomoe to operate openly, but also reflected the fragility of Yoshinaka's position. He could not rely on inherited structures or court-sanctioned hierarchies. He had to build authority in real time, through action. Trust was therefore intensely personal, and betrayal or failure carried devastating consequences. Tomoe's service must also be understood in terms of representation. Warriors close to a leader embodied his values and projected his strength. Their conduct reflected directly on him. By placing Tomoe in visible roles, Yoshinaka implicitly affirmed her competence and loyalty to both his followers and his enemies. Her presence challenged expectations without explicitly confronting them, demonstrating that effectiveness mattered more than conformity when survival was at stake. This was not ideological progress, but pragmatic adaptation under extreme pressure. The nature of warfare during the Genpei War amplified the importance of such service. Battles were often decided through close combat, individual duels, and moments of sudden collapse or rally. In these situations, leadership was not abstract. It was experienced through the behavior of those fighting nearby. A warrior who stood firm could stabilize a faltering line. One who broke could trigger disaster. Tomoe's reputation for steadfastness would have contributed directly to morale, reinforcing cohesion among those fighting alongside her. Service also involved sacrifice beyond the battlefield. Those closest to Yoshinaka were bound to him even as his prospects dimmed. As rival Minamoto forces closed in and political support evaporated, continued loyalty became increasingly costly. To remain was to accept the likelihood of defeat and death. This context reframes Tomoe's actions not as reckless bravery, but as conscious commitment to a cause already slipping toward collapse. Such commitment carried moral weight within warrior culture, elevating loyalty itself as a form of victory even in defeat. It is important to resist reading later romantic ideals into this relationship. Tomoe is sometimes portrayed in modern retellings as a heroic exception, standing apart from the men around her. The historical record suggests the opposite. She is remembered precisely because she stood within the structure of service, not outside it. Her actions mattered because they aligned with the expectations of her role, fulfilling them with uncommon intensity rather than rejecting them outright. The absence of personal commentary from Tomoe herself reinforces this interpretation. She is not recorded as questioning her duty or seeking recognition. Her presence is defined entirely through action. This silence is consistent with the values of the time, where self-expression was secondary to service and reputation was constructed collectively. To act decisively and loyally was to speak clearly enough. By examining Tomoe Gozen's service within Yoshinaka's command, one sees not a lone figure defying her world, but a warrior operating at the highest level of its demands. Her loyalty was not symbolic, her command not ceremonial. She functioned where pressure was greatest, where failure would be fatal, and where history would later look for meaning in the wreckage of a lost cause. In this context, her role emerges with clarity, not as an anomaly imposed on the past, but as a product of service carried to its furthest edge. As Minamoto no Yoshinaka's campaign gained momentum, the conflict surrounding him began to shift in character. What had initially appeared as a unified uprising against the Terra gradually exposed fractures within the Minamoto themselves. Success brought visibility, and visibility invited rivalry. The Genpei War was no longer defined solely by opposition between clans. It became a struggle over who within the victorious side would claim legitimacy, authority, and the right to shape Japan's future. This internal escalation proved more dangerous to Yoshinaka than any external enemy. The Minamoto clan was not a single, cohesive body, but a network of related lineages bound loosely by name and circumstance. Years of exile, regional separation, and divergent experiences had produced leaders with fundamentally different priorities. Yoshinaka's rise from the provinces challenged the emerging dominance of figures like Minamoto no Yoritomo, who was carefully consolidating power in the east. While both men claimed to fight for the same cause, their visions of leadership were incompatible. Yoshinaka embodied direct military action and immediate results, while Yoritomo pursued control through alliances, legitimacy, and long-term governance. As Yoshinaka advanced toward Kyoto, his presence disrupted delicate political calculations. His victories against the Taira were undeniable, but they were achieved without coordination with other Minamoto leaders. To Yoritomo, this independence represented not heroism, but a threat. A successful Yoshinaka operating beyond his control could undermine the authority Yoritomo sought to establish over all Minamoto forces. The war, therefore, began to escalate inward, as strategic cooperation gave way to suspicion and containment. This internal tension manifested in subtle but decisive ways. Supplies were restricted, reinforcements delayed, and communication strained. Orders issued from afar carried political intent as much as military necessity. Yoshinaka found himself fighting not only to defeat enemies, but to maintain relevance within his own clan. Each decision he made was scrutinized, not for effectiveness alone, but for how it altered the balance of power among the Minamoto leadership. The pressure intensified when Yoshinaka entered Kyoto. Though he arrived as a victor, his control over the capital was fragile. The court, exhausted by years of conflict, feared disorder as much as domination. Yoshinaka's inability to navigate court politics reinforced perceptions of him as a provincial warrior unsuited to national leadership. These perceptions were amplified by his rivals, who framed his actions as reckless and destabilizing. The escalation within the Minamoto clan thus took on a political dimension, transforming military rivalry into a contest over narrative and legitimacy. For those serving Yoshinaka, this shift narrowed options dramatically. Loyalty now carried greater risk, as remaining aligned with him meant standing against the broader momentum of the Minamoto cause as defined by Yoritomo. The war's internal escalation forced warriors to choose between personal allegiance and strategic survival. Such choices were rarely abstract. They involved abandoning comrades, breaking oaths, or accepting likely defeat. Each defection weakened Yoshinaka's position further, accelerating his isolation. Tomoe Gozen's continued presence during this phase underscores the severity of the moment. As internal opposition intensified, the circle of Yoshinaka's loyal retainers contracted. Those who remained were bound not by expectation of victory, but by commitment to shared fate. The escalation within the Minamoto clan transformed loyalty from a virtue into a liability, making steadfastness increasingly costly. To stand firm was no longer a path to reward. It was a declaration of refusal to abandon one's lord even as circumstances turned against him. This internal conflict also altered the tone of warfare. Battles were no longer fought solely to defeat a common enemy, but to assert dominance within a collapsing alliance. Engagements carried symbolic weight, signaling allegiance as much as strategy. Victory against fellow Minamoto forces would legitimize authority, defeat would erase it. The war thus became more personal, more unforgiving, as former allies faced one another under banners bearing the same name. The escalation exposed structural weaknesses in Yoshinaka's leadership. His authority, built on momentum and loyalty, lacked the institutional support his rivals cultivated. Where Yoritomo could absorb losses and reposition strategically, Yoshinaka's setbacks were cumulative. Each defeat reduced his following, Each loss of trust amplified doubt. Internal opposition did not merely challenge him. It reshaped the battlefield itself, constraining movement and limiting choices. Yet this period also clarified Yoshinaka's character. Faced with mounting pressure from within his own clan, he did not retreat into negotiation or submission. Instead, he doubled down on action, committing fully to a course he could no longer alter. This resolve inspired fierce loyalty among those who remained, even as it alienated potential allies. The escalation within the Minamoto clan thus hardened positions on all sides, turning political disagreement into irreversible conflict. By this stage of the war, inevitability began to take shape. The forces aligned against Yoshinaka were not only larger, but better coordinated and politically legitimized. His isolation was no longer temporary. It was structural. The internal escalation had achieved what the Terra alone could not. It had reduced Yoshinaka's cause to a narrowing front defined by loyalty rather than strategy. This chapter of the conflict marks a turning of momentum that is subtle but decisive. The Genpei War was still unfolding, but for Yoshinaka and those bound to him, the outcome was beginning to crystallize. The struggle within the Minamoto clan did not simply complicate the war. It determined who would survive to define its meaning. In this tightening space between allegiance and collapse, the actions of individuals would soon carry their greatest weight, not as instruments of victory, but as measures of resolve in the face of an ending that could no longer be delayed. As the conflict tightened around Minamoto no Yoshinaka, the nature of battle itself began to change. Earlier victories had been achieved through movement, surprise, and momentum, but now each engagement carried the weight of survival and reputation. These were the battles that fixed memory, not because they altered the strategic outcome of the war, but because they revealed character under irreversible pressure. It is within these encounters that Tomoe Gozen's reputation solidified, shaped less by isolated feats than by consistent conduct amid collapse. Warfare during this phase was intimate and brutal. Forces were smaller, resources scarce, and retreat increasingly difficult. Battles often unfolded as a series of violent clashes rather than coordinated maneuvers, with individual warriors forced into direct confrontation. In such conditions, reputation mattered enormously. A warrior known to stand firm could steady others. One known to falter could unravel an entire line. The stories that emerged from these encounters traveled quickly, carried by survivors, and absorbed into collective memory long before they reached written chronicles. Tomoe's actions in these battles are described with a notable emphasis on composure. She is not portrayed as reckless or driven by fury, but as deliberate and controlled. Mounted combat required exceptional balance and judgment, especially when facing seasoned opponents. To remain effective while managing a horse, weapon, and battlefield awareness demanded constant discipline. That chroniclers chose to emphasize these qualities suggests that her conduct exemplified the ideal warrior ethos of the time, grounded in restraint as much as courage. One of the defining elements of these encounters is their symbolic weight. As Yoshinaka's forces dwindled, every battle became a statement. To engage the enemy was to assert continued legitimacy, even when defeat loomed. Tomoe's presence in the vanguard of such engagements reinforced the image of a command that refused to dissolve quietly. Her visibility mattered. It communicated resolve to allies and defiance to enemies, shaping how Yoshinaka's resistance would later be remembered. The descriptions of Tomoe facing powerful opponents are particularly revealing. Strength alone was not enough to earn recognition. Many warriors were strong. What distinguished her in the record was the combination of physical capability and fearlessness in situations where fear was rational. To confront an enemy known for ferocity required not ignorance of danger, but acceptance of it. Chroniclers framed these moments not as spectacles, but as tests of worth, passed through action rather than proclamation. Importantly, these battles did not occur in isolation. They were part of a continuous retreat, a sequence of engagements fought while pressed from multiple sides. Fatigue, hunger, and uncertainty eroded morale. In such circumstances, the ability to fight effectively was inseparable from the ability to endure. Tomoe's repeated participation under these conditions contributed to her reputation more than any single dramatic act. Consistency under strain was the truest measure of a warrior. These encounters also illuminate how medieval narratives constructed memory. Chroniclers selected moments that encapsulated broader truths. Tomoe's battlefield conduct became a vessel through which loyalty, courage, and inevitability could be expressed. She was not elevated above the conflict. She was embedded within it. Her actions gained meaning because they occurred at the edge of defeat, where effort could no longer secure victory but could still define honor. There's also restraint in how violence is portrayed. While later retellings often exaggerate brutality, the original tone remains measured. Combat is acknowledged as deadly and decisive, but not glorified beyond necessity. This restraint reinforces the credibility of the account. Tomoe's reputation emerges not from excess, but from proportion. She is remembered because her actions aligned precisely with what the moment demanded, no more and no less. As Yoshinaka's situation worsened, these battles took on an almost ritual quality. Each engagement reaffirmed bonds among those who remained. To fight together repeatedly under diminishing odds forged a collective identity rooted in shared fate. Tomoe's role within this identity was not symbolic femininity or exceptionality, but reliability. She was one of those who could be counted on when options disappeared. This is the quiet foundation of reputation that survives when louder claims collapse. The accumulation of these encounters gradually fixed Tomoe Gozen in the historical imagination, not as a single heroic image, but as a pattern of behavior repeated across moments of danger. Her reputation was not constructed afterward. It was formed in real time through observation and retelling by those who witnessed her conduct. By the time chroniclers recorded her name, her standing had already been established among warriors who measured worth through experience rather than narrative. These defining battles did not change the course of the Genpei War. They did not rescue Yoshinaka's cause or reverse the internal collapse of Minamoto unity. Their importance lies elsewhere. They preserved a record of how individuals met the narrowing path between survival and loyalty. In that narrowing space, Tomoe's actions provided a clarity that outlasted defeat. What endures from this phase is not victory, but credibility. Tomoe Gozen's reputation rests on the simple fact that when circumstances stripped away advantage, safety, and future reward, she continued to act with precision and resolve. The battles that defined her were not chosen, they were endured. And it is through that endurance, repeated until the end approached unmistakably, that her name secured a place in history without needing amplification, myth, or justification. As Minamoto no Yoshinaka's resistance narrowed, the war entered a phase defined less by momentum than by contraction. What had once been a broad campaign across provinces and routes became a desperate struggle to remain intact as a fighting force. Strategic collapse did not arrive through a single catastrophic defeat, but through a sequence of losses, withdrawals, and missed opportunities that steadily reduced Yoshinaka's room to act. Each decision closed off another path, until movement itself became a liability rather than an advantage. The loss of allies was the most immediate and damaging consequence. Warriors who had once rallied to Yoshinaka during his rise began to reassess their positions as internal Minamoto opposition hardened. Loyalty, once rewarded with shared success, now carried increasing risk. Some retainers defected quietly, others openly aligned with rival Minamoto leaders. These departures weakened Yoshinaka not only numerically, but psychologically. Every absence signaled diminishing confidence, reinforcing the perception that his cause was no longer viable. Geography compounded these pressures. As rival forces coordinated their movements, Yoshinaka found himself hemmed in by terrain that had once favored him. Mountain passes that once provided cover became traps. Rivers and valleys limited retreat and exposed supply lines. Control of key routes shifted to his enemies, forcing his army into reactive movement. Instead of choosing where to fight, Yoshinaka was increasingly compelled to respond to threats as they emerged, ceding initiative at every turn. Strategic isolation followed swiftly. Communication with potential supporters became unreliable, and coordination with distant allies collapsed entirely. Yoshinaka's forces operated with incomplete information, often learning of enemy movements too late to adjust effectively. This fog of war intensified exhaustion and uncertainty, eroding the cohesion that had sustained earlier successes. Under such conditions, even skilled commanders struggled to maintain order, as fear and fatigue blurred judgment. For those who remained loyal, the situation demanded constant readiness. There was no longer a secure rear or a predictable line of retreat. Every engagement carried the possibility of final encirclement. Supplies dwindled, horses weakened, and the physical toll of sustained campaigning became unavoidable. Yet despite these conditions, Yoshinaka continued to resist withdrawal into submission. His persistence, while admirable within the warrior ethic, further narrowed the strategic horizon, committing his followers to a path with few remaining exits. The collapse was not solely military. Politically, Yoshinaka had lost the contest for legitimacy. His rivals framed his actions as destabilizing and dangerous, persuading the court and neutral parties that his elimination was necessary for order. This narrative justified coordinated action against him and stripped away any remaining moral leverage he might have claimed. Once labeled a threat rather than a liberator, Yoshinaka's cause was effectively severed from broader support. Within this shrinking sphere, loyalty took on a different character. It was no longer aligned with expectation of victory or reward, but with acceptance of consequence. Those who stayed did so with full awareness that survival was unlikely. This clarity stripped away ambiguity, leaving only commitment or departure. For warriors like Tomoe Gozen, this phase represented the purest expression of service. Action was no longer strategic in the conventional sense. It was declarative, affirming allegiance through continued presence. The psychological weight of this isolation cannot be overstated. To fight while knowing that defeat is probable requires a different kind of resolve than fighting for advancement or hope. Every decision became a test of endurance rather than ambition. The meaning of combat shifted from achieving outcomes to preserving honor. In such moments, individual conduct carried heightened significance, not because it could change fate, but because it defined how fate would be met. Yoshinaka's command reflected this narrowing reality. Orders became simpler, more direct, focused on immediate survival rather than long-term planning. The hierarchy tightened around those he trusted absolutely. This concentration of authority reinforced unity among the remaining corps, even as it underscored their isolation from the broader conflict. The army became smaller, but more cohesive, bound by shared understanding of what lay ahead. This stage of collapse also reshaped memory. Chroniclers later emphasized these moments because they revealed character stripped of advantage. The absence of triumph sharpened focus on behavior. Who remained, who fled, who stood firm when retreat was possible. Tomoe's continued presence within Yoshinaka's shrinking forces gains meaning here, not as a dramatic gesture, but as evidence of sustained commitment under the most unfavorable conditions. As options vanished, inevitability took hold. The strategic collapse was complete when Yoshinaka could no longer influence events beyond his immediate surroundings. His cause had been reduced to resistance without leverage, courage without prospect. Yet within the logic of warrior culture, this did not render his struggle meaningless. On the contrary, it clarified it. Value was no longer measured by success, but by consistency of action aligned with duty. This isolation set the stage for what followed. The conflict had moved beyond escalation into conclusion, though its final shape was not yet realized. Yoshinaka's forces were no longer fighting to win the war. They were fighting to meet its end on their own terms. In this constricted space, Every action acquired a gravity disproportionate to its scale, and every figure who remained would be remembered not for altering history, but for how they stood when history closed around them. The final confrontation arrived not with surprise, but with a sense of grim inevitability. By the time Minamoto no Yoshinaka's remaining forces reached the plains of Owazu, the conflict had narrowed to its decisive point. There was no longer any strategic ambiguity, no illusion of escape or reversal. The opposing Minamoto armies, led by commanders aligned with Yoritomo, moved with clarity of purpose, intent on extinguishing Yoshinaka's resistance completely. Owazu was not chosen for advantage. It was reached because there was nowhere else to go. The terrain offered little protection. Open ground replaced the mountains and routes that had once provided Yoshinaka with maneuverability. His force, reduced and exhausted, faced opponents who were better supplied, numerically superior, and politically legitimized. The imbalance was obvious to all involved. This was not a battle to decide the war, but a confrontation meant to close it. For Yoshinaka, and those still beside him, Owazu marked the end of movement and the beginning of final reckoning. Accounts of the battle emphasize its speed and brutality. The fighting was direct, without prolonged maneuver or negotiation. Yoshinaka's forces met the attack head-on, not because victory was expected, but because withdrawal would have meant dissolution. In warrior culture, to scatter without resistance was to forfeit honor entirely. Standing ground, even in defeat, preserved meaning. The clash at Owazu, therefore, carried symbolic weight beyond its tactical outcome. It was a declaration of refusal to disappear quietly. Within this confrontation, the historical record becomes more focused and more uncertain at the same time. Chroniclers describe individual actions with vivid detail, yet disagree on sequence and outcome. This is particularly true regarding Tomoe Gozen. Some accounts place her at the forefront of the fighting, engaging powerful enemy warriors with composure and skill. Others suggest her departure from the battlefield occurred earlier at Yoshinaka's command. These variations are not contradictions to be resolved, but reflections of how memory forms around moments of collapse. What remains consistent is the framing of the moment as a turning point beyond recovery. Yoshinaka's death, whether preceded or followed by Tomoe's final recorded action, marked the absolute end of his cause. The battle did not transition into retreat or regrouping. It concluded the conflict for his faction entirely. In this sense, Owazu functions less as a climax and more as a closing bracket, sealing a narrative already determined by prior isolation and collapse. The ambiguity surrounding Tomoe's role at Owazu has invited later interpretation, often shaped by modern expectations of heroism and sacrifice. Medieval chroniclers, however, did not seek dramatic resolution in the contemporary sense. Their interest lay in illustrating virtue, loyalty, and fate. Whether Tomoe fought to the end or withdrew under command, both possibilities aligned with warrior ethics. Obedience to one's lord was as honorable as personal valor, and survival did not negate loyalty if it followed duty. This uncertainty is instructive. It reminds us that turning points in history are not always clean or theatrically resolved. They are often messy, fragmented, and imperfectly remembered. The battle at Owazu was decisive not because of a singular heroic act, but because it represented the moment when all remaining paths closed. From that point forward, the war's outcome no longer depended on contested action, but on the consolidation of power by the victors. Emotionally, Owazu carries a different weight than earlier battles. There is no sense of rising tension or dramatic escalation. Instead, there is compression. Fear, loyalty, exhaustion, and resolve converge into a narrow span of time where action replaces deliberation. For those present, the battle would have felt less like a choice and more like an obligation fulfilled. The language of the sources reflects this compression, focusing on decisive moments rather than extended struggle. Yoshinaka's death crystallized his legacy. In defeat, he became a cautionary figure, remembered for both his early success and his failure to adapt to political reality. Yet within warrior memory, his final stand preserved a measure of respect. He did not submit, flee, or negotiate survival at the expense of loyalty. He met the end of his cause directly. This posture shaped how those associated with him, including Tomoe, would be remembered thereafter. 4. Tomoe Gozen. Owazu represents the boundary of historical certainty. Beyond this point, the record falls silent or shifts into speculation. That silence is itself a consequence of the turning point. Once Yoshinaka was gone, the narrative no longer followed those who had served him unless they intersected again with power. Tomoe's disappearance from the battlefield mirrors the disappearance of the cause that had given her visibility. History moved on, carrying forward the victors and leaving others suspended in memory. The turning point at Owazu did not resolve every question, nor did it provide moral closure. It resolved momentum. The struggle that followed would be about consolidation, governance, and legacy rather than survival. Owazu marks the precise moment when the Genpei War ceased to be open-ended and became directional, flowing toward an outcome that would reshape Japan's political order. In this sense, the battle's significance lies not in its drama, but in its finality. It represents the moment when individual resolve could no longer influence collective fate. For those who stood there, action still mattered, but only in how it would be remembered, not in what it could change. That distinction defines a true turning point, one where history pivots quietly, leaving behind fragments of courage, ambiguity, and silence where certainty once seemed possible. After the collapse, at Owazu, Tomoe Gozen disappears from the historical record with striking abruptness. Unlike the deaths of prominent commanders, which were carefully noted and contextualized, her fate is left unresolved. This silence is not accidental, nor is it unusual within medieval Japanese historiography. It reflects the way history was recorded. Attention followed power, victory, and lineage. Once Minamoto no Yoshinaka was eliminated, the narrative focus shifted entirely to those who would shape the new political order. Those who had served a defeated cause, no matter how capable or loyal, were no longer central to the story being written. The sources that mention Tomoe do not extend beyond the final phase of Yoshinaka's resistance. After that point, there are no confirmed records of her actions, location, or death. Later traditions would attempt to fill this void with speculation, suggesting various outcomes such as withdrawal into religious life, marriage, or quiet obscurity. None of these accounts can be verified. What matters historically is not which version is most appealing, but why the record allows for such uncertainty in the first place. Medieval chronicles were not biographies in the modern sense. They did not seek to preserve complete lives, especially of those outside ruling elites. Individuals appeared in the record when their actions intersected with events deemed significant to the political and moral order. Once that intersection ended, so did the documentation. Tomoe's visibility was tied directly to Yoshinaka's command and the battles that defined his final resistance. When that structure vanished, so too did the narrative space that had contained her. This disappearance underscores an important distinction between modern expectations and medieval realities. Today, we often look for closure, for a final accounting of a figure's life that explains meaning or legacy. Medieval chroniclers were less concerned with resolution than with alignment. A life mattered insofar as it illustrated loyalty, virtue, or failure within a larger pattern. Tomoe's story had already served that function. Her continued existence beyond the battlefield did not advance the moral or political arc being recorded, and so it was left unremarked. The ambiguity surrounding her fate has sometimes been interpreted as neglect or erasure. In truth, it reflects the limits of historical memory rather than a judgment on her worth. Many warriors, male and female alike, vanish from the record once they no longer influenced events. Survival did not guarantee remembrance. In some cases, it diminished it. To live on quietly after defeat was not a condition that attracted chroniclers' attention. Death in service or visible loyalty under collapse carried greater narrative weight than endurance beyond the war. For Tomoe Gozen, this silence creates a paradox. Her presence in the record is vivid but brief, and her absence afterward is total. This sharp contrast has fueled later fascination, but also preserves her image in a specific state. She is remembered at the height of action, unaltered by later compromise, adaptation, or reinvention. History does not show her aging, negotiating, or adjusting to a changed political world. It leaves her fixed in the moment when loyalty and danger were inseparable. This fixedness contributes to the enduring clarity of her portrayal. She is not remembered for what she became, but for how she acted when circumstances were most severe. In this sense, disappearance functions almost as a form of containment. It prevents later actions, which might have been ordinary or constrained, from diluting the intensity of her remembered conduct. The record preserves her at the point where meaning was most concentrated. At the same time, this absence reminds us of the cost of defeat. When a cause fails, its participants often lose more than power or position. They lose narrative continuity. Their stories fragment or end abruptly, absorbed into the margins of history. Tomoe's disappearance reflects this broader pattern. It is not an individual anomaly, but part of how medieval societies process loss. The victors moved forward, constructing legitimacy and order, while the defeated receded into silence. Speculation about Tomoe's later life, while understandable, risks imposing modern desires onto a past that operated differently. Whether she lived on or died soon after Owazu cannot be known with certainty. What can be known is that her historical significance was already complete by the time she vanished from the record. Her actions have been witnessed, judged, and recorded according to the standards of her time. Nothing further was required for her to fulfill her place in history. The disappearance from the battlefield, therefore, should not be read as an absence of meaning. It is instead a boundary. Beyond it lies conjecture, folklore, and later reinterpretation. Within it lies the historical Tomoe Gozen, defined by service, loyalty, and composure under collapse. The silence that follows is not empty. It is the natural conclusion of a narrative that had reached its limit. In this way, Tomoe's vanishing mirrors the fate of Yoshinaka's cause itself. Both end not with elaboration, but with cessation. History turns its attention elsewhere, leaving behind a figure suspended between record and legend. That suspension is not a flaw in the story. It is part of its structure. It marks the moment when action gave way to memory, and when what mattered most was no longer what happened next, but what had already been done and witnessed. In the centuries that followed the Genpei War, Tomoe Gozen did not remain confined to the brief mentions preserved in medieval chronicles. Instead, her image migrated into layers of memory, retelling, and cultural adaptation, each shaped by the needs and values of the period that engaged with her story. This process did not simply preserve the past, it reinterpreted it. Through this transformation, Tomoe moved from historical figure to remembered presence, occupying a space where record and imagination intersect without fully merging. The earliest depictions of Tomoe are restrained and functional, consistent with the chronicle tradition that recorded her actions without elaboration. Later generations, however, encountered these sparse references as fragments rather than complete narratives. The gaps invited expansion. Storytellers, playwrights, and poets did not invent Tomoe from nothing. They worked outward from what little was known, amplifying traits already present in the record. Her courage became exemplary, her loyalty absolute, her martial skill refined into idealized form. These developments were less about altering history than about making it legible and resonant for new audiences. One of the most significant arenas for this transformation was performance. In medieval and early modern Japan, oral storytelling and theatrical traditions played a central role in transmitting historical memory. Tales associated with the Genpei War were recited, dramatized, and adapted repeatedly, each retelling emphasizing different elements. Tomoe's presence within these narratives offered a compelling contrast to the overwhelmingly male cast of warriors. She became a focal point through which themes of loyalty, tragedy, and impermanence could be explored without disrupting the broader moral structure of the story. Importantly, these later portrayals did not always seek historical precision. They sought emotional and symbolic coherence. Tomoe was often depicted as embodying conflicting qualities: strength and beauty, ferocity and restraint, loyalty and loss. These tensions made her an effective vessel for reflection on the costs of war and the fragility of human endeavor. Rather than diminishing her significance, this symbolic layering extended it, allowing her story to speak to concerns far removed from the 12th century. Yet even as her image evolved, certain boundaries remained intact. Tomoe was rarely portrayed as a revolutionary figure challenging the social order. Instead, she was framed as exceptional within it, a loyal retainer whose actions affirmed, rather than undermined, warrior values. This framing preserved continuity with the original sources. It ensured that her later remembrance did not contradict the ethical foundation upon which her historical record rested. Adaptation occurred, but remained anchored to loyalty and service. This process also reveals how societies remember selectively. Many figures from the Genpei War faded entirely from cultural memory, their names preserved only in genealogies or footnotes. Tomoe endured because her story could be reshaped without losing coherence. Her brief historical appearance offered just enough definition to sustain reinterpretation without imposing strict limits. In this sense, the scarcity of detail became an asset. It allowed later generations to see in her what they needed to see, while still pointing back to a recognizable origin. The tension between history and legend becomes especially visible when comparing depictions across time.